Hello, everyone. You are watching the Asian American Herald, a new media network for and about Asian Americans in the capital region of New York. This show is being aired via live stream on Facebook, and a recording will be available afterwards at our Facebook page, Asian American Herald. My name is Himani Gupta Carlson, and I am a local farmer, writer, and professor at Empire State College in Saratoga Springs. Our guest this evening is Ron Kim, an attorney based in Saratoga Springs who has an impressive record of public service. Over the past 4 decades, Mr. Kim has served as a senior budget analyst for New York City, program director of the National Civic League in the greater New York City area, executive director of the environmental group EarthShare, public safety commissioner for the city of Saratoga Springs, and as president of the Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York. So he's clearly an expert in many areas. Mr. Kim, welcome to our show.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's nice to meet you.
So I'm actually wondering first, if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself personally. Where did you grow up? How long have you lived in the capital region? And really, what are some of the personal passions that led you to take on these various positions that you've held over the course of your career?
Well, I was actually born in Schenectady. My father emigrated from Korea right after the Korean War. He trained in New York City, finished up his medical training, and then for the greatest part of his career, he was actually a general surgeon in Glens Falls. So we settled down in this area, and it's a beautiful area. So it was a great place to grow up. And then after I sort of finished my schooling and doing various things and wanted to settle down with my family, we decided to move to Saratoga because I had a lot of great memories, a lot of good feeling about the area. And now our children are grown up, and I think they feel the same way. It was a great place to grow up. And just getting into some of my sort of how I got into different things. I've always wanted to help people, and that's part of what guided me in my career, working in municipal government, doing some political work. And then as an attorney that practices consumer law and employment discrimination, they sort of fit perfectly with some of the things that I wanted to do with my career. So it's been gratifying to be able to do that in an area where I feel very much at home.
Well, that's really marvelous. So your work as an attorney is focused on bankruptcy, and it really seems that your focus is helping individuals and small businesses who encounter financial difficulty. And so I was kind of wondering if you could connect those dots a little bit more for us.
Well, particularly right now, what we're seeing, obviously, is a lot of financial stress. And I got into bankruptcy somewhat by accident. I had a client 20 years ago who was trying to run a business and was having a problem. It was a small business. And I found that I enjoyed sort of trying to solve difficult problems for people with small businesses and consumers. It's also been a bird's eye view as my career has gone on to sort of see some of the real stresses that modern economy has placed on people. We have two-earner, everyone is a two-earner family. We're required to work many hours to try to keep a roof over our head. Interestingly, Elizabeth Warren, who was a bankruptcy attorney and a scholar at Harvard, really identified some of the real stresses that people have now and how the bankruptcy courts can deal with some of those things. So that's been one of the practice areas that I've really enjoyed because you feel like you're helping people. And, that's critical. And unfortunately, we're starting to see another wave. I saw a wave in 2008 during the foreclosure crisis. And now we're seeing, unfortunately, another wave. It's starting with small businesses again, but we're starting to see that consumers, individuals come in because essentially people are, having difficulty. They don't have jobs, that kind of thing.
Right. It's always interesting to me when I think about activist work. I don't think about entrepreneurism quite so much, though that's changing for me. I I don't think about the economy as much as I should, but I think the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has really started to shift that a bit. But I'm curious, bankruptcy, that very word has such a negative connotation to it. I hear that word and I get scared. I
Mm.
don't want to be someone who has filed for bankruptcy. So I'm wondering, and it's interesting that you cite Elizabeth Warren in kind of thinking of bankruptcy as something that's a way to help people. Um, but I'm wondering, how do you help your clients get over the negative connotations of that word? And how do you kind of show them that this is something that could make a difference for them and really get them back on their feet?
Well, that's an interesting thing. People do really come to me as a last resort. As one of my children said when they were young, Dad, people don't only see you when there are bad things happening. And that unfortunately is true in my bankruptcy practice. And what I try to do is make sure they understand that what's happening to them may be larger. So, for instance, during the foreclosure crisis, a lot of this was not controllable by it had nothing to do with people going off to Las Vegas and spending their mortgage money. It was basically that a tidal wave was hitting them. And so, and the other thing that I try to do is remind people that Walt Disney filed twice. Harry Truman filed a form of bankruptcy. We didn't have the bankruptcy code way back then. There are many people that have done it who we admire and hold up as people that have been successful. So I try to encourage people to look at it as a problem that's solvable legally, perfectly legally, and to focus on the next steps and how this step can sometimes lead to better things. So it's funny you asked that question. Somebody called me the other day and said, I'm calling you because I'm actually selling my house. Do you do that? And I referred them to somebody because I really don't do that anymore. But what part of what she said to me was, you filed my bankruptcy 10 years ago, and here I am now selling my house, and I'm in good shape, and I've done all the things. And that's gratifying because you can sort of take the next steps. It's not the end of your life. As it may not be the best thing, but it is something that is perfectly legal and can sometimes be the key to take the next step and the positive step. As I remind people, it's only money.
Only money. That's interesting because we put a lot of maybe undue value on money. I used to be a business reporter way back in the day, and I used to go to bankruptcy court and collect filings. And I wonder if you could just kind of talk to our listeners a little bit about, like, what does a Chapter 7 and what does a Chapter 11 entail? What are the differences between those two filings?
So there's a series of chapters that all more or less are focused on a different type of debtor who's walking into the bankruptcy court. Chapter 7 is really the only one that includes both corporations and individuals, and it's called the liquidation statute. It essentially, when you walk into the bankruptcy court, you are essentially saying, I want to get rid of my debts and I want to move on. And if there's assets for the bankruptcy court to liquidate, they can do that and they can pay off my creditors. So it's probably the form of bankruptcy that's most complete in some ways. Then 11 and 13 are basically reorganizations, 11 being a corporate reorganization, 13 being an individual. So, for instance, in the 2008 foreclosure crisis, we saw a lot of 13s. Why? People were coming in trying to reorganize their mortgage, trying to get it into a situation where they could begin to pay. So the difference of the two bankruptcies, the dividing line between a 7 and 11 and 13 is, one, you're in a 13, 11, you're going to pay money, whether it be your corporation or your personal. In a 7, you're essentially just saying, I want to get rid of these debts and I want to move on with my life. And so there are solutions to specific problems.
Okay. So with the pandemic, underway now, really causing a lot of, it's really completely stopped our economy and doesn't look like it's going to ease up at least for several months, if not another year. Do you anticipate more 7s or 13s or 11s?
So my prediction is it'll be more 7s, but I'm not very good at that. When the last big crisis rolled around, as I said, it was a lot of 13 work. It was a lot of reorganizations. The reason I'm anticipating a lot of 7s is simply because people are probably extending themselves with credit cards and other debts which are a little easier to get rid of in a bankruptcy, and so in a Chapter 7. So that maybe we'll see that. One of the things I've seen in my practice and talked to other attorneys is right now it's not people. It's a little. We haven't seen the big tidal wave. We're still starting to see where things are picking up. It's getting busier, but this is maybe a good sign, is the steps that Congress has taken and the state government here, I think, have helped people keep their head above water. And that's, in the end, if we can avoid a bankruptcy, I always tell people, do it.
Yeah, that's a hopeful sign, and I guess we'll just see how that transpires as the months go on.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to kind of shift focus a little more now and just talk a little bit about being Asian American in the Saratoga area. So we both know that Saratoga is a great place to live, and you kind of expressed that right at the beginning of our conversation. But we also know that there are very few people here of Asian ancestry, and I'm just kind of wondering, you talked a little about what prompted you to make Saratoga your home, but to what extent have you been able to build a sense of, I guess, community here and then also Asian community here? How do you go about finding people to interact with? Who do you interact with?
So I keep in touch with through some of the organizations that I identify, like APABA, the Asian American. There is actually an Asian American Bar Association of New York State that largely is in New York City, and I spend some time down there. So there are some vehicles to sort of interact. And then I have met over time people in Saratoga, et cetera, that, I've become friendly with and we keep in touch with. It's a growing population. It's certainly much larger than when I came here with my father, where, in Glens Falls, we were pretty much the only Asian American family at all. But it's still, I think, not as diversified as we'd like to see it. It was good to see for my children, who now are out of college, but went through the Saratoga High School system in the 2000s. They had they had a diversity of friends, and I think that experience is good for them. But hopefully it'll continue to grow. People who come here from various parts of the world will find this a great place to live. What's funny for my father was what brought him here were the Adirondack Mountains. He always said it reminded him of where he grew up in Korea. Which is funny because I can look out. We're on a lake, and we can look out on those mountains, and it's great for the summertime.
Yeah.
To see sort of what brought him here.
Yeah, it's interesting. My parents, they immigrated first to Iowa, and then they ultimately settled in Indiana, and they've been there ever since. And in so many ways, there's so many aspects of the flatlands of Indiana that are reminiscent of the plains part of India where they both came from. So, even though the connections are, even though there's so much culturally that's just completely different, there are these kind of environmental points of connectivity.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we talked a little earlier about, before the show went on the air, about the story of my parents used to have. When I was a child, we would get these random phone calls from Indians who were recent immigrants. They often were students coming to Ball State University, which was the university in my hometown. And they would pull out the phone book and they would search for a Gupta or a Patel or another Indian last name. And then they would make a phone call. And that was one way that my parents built community, because they would go and pick up these students, invite them for dinner. And, many, many years, decades later, we're all still kind of friends. And I was kind of wondering if you had similar memories of being the Kims of Glens Falls growing up in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I love that question because it was so much of how I grew up, and then also being in Saratoga, because we have the same thing. We had an individual, one of old family friend who came to Glens Falls, who wanted to start a taekwondo. Didn't know my father, but looked him up in the book, and the next thing you know, we were moving furniture into his apartment, and he ended up starting the taekwondo studio in our little town, and we pretty much didn't have that, and so there was and if there was an Asian medical connection, healthcare worker in town, they were always at our house for dinner and stuff, and the same thing growing up in Saratoga. I was part of Rotary for years, and we would always have the cultural exchange, and we'd always have we had several Asian American families stay at our house, and that was a great opportunity for my children to basically learn a little bit more about their culture, actually, because several times we had some Korean families over. So it's an excellent opportunity, because you don't get that in the smaller towns and areas of upstate New York sometimes, as you'd like.
Yeah. I teach an Asian American Studies course at Empire State College, and I'm actually looking forward to getting the show streamed into the class somehow, because it's really giving us live, real oral histories and ethnography of Asian American experiences. But I always encourage them to go out and look for Asian Americans in their own communities, no matter how small. Because I tell them that it's highly likely that they'll find something.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You just got to go out, and it's not as easy up here, but you do have to take the steps to go out there. That's true.
Yeah. So I spent some time in Hawaii, and Korean plate lunch was my thing. and I'm just waiting for that to come to upstate New
Mm.
York. I may have to wait a long time or learn how to do it myself, but I used to absolutely love, the plate of kalbi or
Oh yeah,
the rice, scoop of macaroni, and then the fork.
yeah. My daughter, who's now 25, she got her master's in Nanjing, and so spent uh, uh, 2 semesters there through programs through uh, uh, forget international studies program in I'm forgetting the name of the school now here but in any event, so we were able to go out there and sort of spend some time with her, and it was a great experience to sort of see her as, a sort of second generation going back to China and learning the language and interacting. So yeah, it's a great experience, and she's connected with a lot of her friends there and stuff. And they're going to be getting married in a year, and we're going to get to see some of her fellow students.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Hopefully everything will be good with travel.
Yeah, we've gone through that, sort of looking at canceling weddings, because I have children at that wedding age, and they're all they're all looking for dates that they can do this and get more than if there's so many limits on groups and stuff now that so.
Yeah. I've got a niece getting married next year, and
congratulations. That's great.
So fingers crossed that it'll work out.
Yeah.
So one thing also, you've been involved in politics. Your position as public safety commissioner was an elected office, and you did make an attempt to do a run against Elise Stefanik, the congressman representing our district, who is a Republican. And I'm kind of wanting to ask you this question from a couple of vantage points. What would it mean for an Asian American to hold a national office, a national seat from this area? How would that actually change the dynamic here? And to some extent also, what prompted you to consider making that run in the first place?
Well, there were different reasons for the different offices, but basically it all comes down to I think that we all have an obligation to give back in the way we can. At the time, running for Commissioner of Public Safety was an opportunity to sort of give back to Saratoga. And with the things that were happening around the time that this was 2016 election, particularly some of the real problematic bias I saw in against also Asian Americans, I thought, if I could change some of that dynamic by being out there, that would be a good thing. And so decided to run for Congress. I'm glad Tetra Cobb is she won, and she's now continuing on, and that's great. And I wish her all the best. I think she's a great candidate. What is it? What I've been struck, and maybe growing up, it didn't really connect with me. But what I've been struck by is how, people have said seeing somebody who is up there like me makes a big difference. I don't know if I ever consciously thought of that, but I think that probably is true. And so, yeah, if, as our society moves along, I'm hoping we're going to see an Asian American in high office and maybe the highest office. It was. Well, I was actually at Obama's 2008 convention. I was a delegate.
Okay.
And I loved the fact that I attended several Asian American caucuses. And I love the fact that he really reached out. I did not at the time know that he had some roots in our community. And that was, something that was real. He appeared at one of our caucuses. And of course, there's lots of commitment for the candidate. He was only there about 10 minutes, but it was great to sort of hear him and hear how committed he was to some of the issues that the Asian American Democratic Caucus had at the time. And, I someday they'll be there. Someday, maybe, I know that, one of the people top on the list right now is Kamala Harris. So maybe we'll see something, sooner rather than later. And that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of strong Asian American leadership in some parts of the U.S. Congress right now. I used to live in Seattle, and I actually lived in the district that Pramila Jayapal represents now, and so I do follow her pretty closely, and am just extremely proud that I would be voting for her if I still lived in Seattle.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. When you were talking earlier, just a few minutes ago, I was actually remembering I went to Obama's inaugurations both in 2009 and 2013. And I went as a member of the crowd, so I didn't have any ticket or anything special. And I actually taught it to my students. But I remember distinctly in 2009 as I was like so far behind I was way in the back, like behind the Washington Monument.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a little boy like right next to me, and he just kept saying, Obama, Obama, Obama. And I just thought, and he was African American. And I thought, it's so meaningful to have a face that looks like yours in a position that's got a high office.
Yeah, a few years ago, we went to the White House and toured it, and at the time, there was a picture of him, and I think it's been mentioned in various places, where a little African American boy, is rubbing his head, and they said it was Obama's favorite picture because this little boy asked, basically, "Can I touch your hair?"
Yeah,
and, that really brings it home. Really.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that story too. So when you were a kid, if you're looking back now, were there heroes, either real or fictitious, or television or movies, who were Asian American for you?
To be honest, no. I was more of a superhero comic book type.
Okay.
And there, here's, my confession there is that my favorite hero were the black-haired guys, not the, blonde, blue-eyed guys. So Superman and maybe that was a subconscious thing, but that was sort of my thing as a little boy. So, but it was one of those things where, you sort of, maybe you don't realize what you're thinking when how you're relating to that. So,
yeah, I think about that in hindsight a lot. Mary Tyler Moore.
Yes.
Worked in the newsroom, and I was prompted to go into journalism because that seemed like a career that women could do in the 70s when I was making those choices. And then of course there's Wonder Woman.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Kim.
Well, thank you. It was very nice to meet you.
Marvelous, marvelous conversation. And unfortunately, we're out of time.
Well, thanks.
Hopefully we'll have you back at some point in the future.
And hope to meet you in person. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for our weekly Asian American Herald show. I'm Himani Gupta Carlson, and our guest has been Mr. Ron Kim, a Saratoga Springs attorney and former public safety commissioner. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community among Asian Americans in the Capital Region. So please send us story ideas and look for the recording of the show on our Facebook page. Have a good evening. And thank you.